Now we'll move to Peder, the civil liability, DAOs. Peder,
thank you. Thank you very much. First, I will start to thank you, the organizer, for arranging such an amazing conference. I'm happy to be part of it, and I hope I will be able to participate in person next time. Little about me. I work in a central bank with issues such as CBDC and crypto assets regulation. So the topic I'm talking about today is not directly related to my work at the central bank. So it rather reflects my private research. So I speak for my own here. My background, most of us have had a life before blockchain and cryptocurrencies and things like that. And before I entered into this world, I worked mostly with antitrust law and law and economics. So kind of my approach to this space is sort of influenced by that. So now I am changing my slide here. Have you gotten the slide changed on your screen?
Yes, Mark.
That's good. So the topics I will be talking about today is I have DAOs and civil liability is a huge topic, so I have sort of narrowed it into some policy consideration. I will not talk so much about black letter law. I will more look at some high-level principles. And I will kind of have much of the talks here today has covered much of what I've said already. So I'm more concerned, much is about aligning or kind of accommodating law for DAOs. I'm more concerned with aligning civil liability for DAO organized activities with the high-level goals of civil liability. And the high-level goals of civil liability is discussable. Much is written about that. It's about protecting private integrity, property, and autonomy, and to provide compensation for civil wrongs. It's about maintaining social order and legal certainty. And we also use civil liability instrumentally for public policy goals. For instance, limited liability as such is sort of a instrumental use of liability or non-liability to achieve certain goals. The topics I will discuss today is what kind of legal creature a DAO is, the DAO and civil liability nexus. I will ask if a specialized DAO civil liability regime is required. I will talk about how to maintain responsibility for DAO organized activities. And I will talk about aligning DAO organized activities with public policies. And I've also asked the question if code is law is a good policy. My approach is law and economics. That's where my background is. So it's sort of affected by that, my talk. So what kind of legal creature is a DAO? You can look at it in different ways. It can be an instrument for its operators. And sort of those who hold the hammer, whether it's a bunch of people or whether it's one person, could be liable for using that hammer as a DAO. It could also be operated by some limited liability entity to kind of absorb the liability of the DAO, which is how I understand a legal wrapper. Also, many jurisdictions are experimenting with granting some sort of legal personhood to DAOs. And they are often combined with limited liability. An approach that I find quite useful is to look at them as some artificial autonomous agent, more of like a robot. And as a robot, maybe in the future, robots will have some full or limited personhood status. But maybe a more useful approach is that they are maybe considered an agent more than an instrument. So they can have some sort of a personhood, like a child, for instance, can have some sort of a personhood. And then the question is those who are principals for that agent can be liable for that agent. And you can use agency law in that context. So it's a different way to look at the DAOs. When it comes to the sort of nexus between DAO and civil liability, They can emerge in various ways. They can emerge from torts, contracts, and violation of other civil laws. And civil liability might emerge between the members and participants of a DAO. For instance, some participant might pursue self-interest and in that context be liable to the other parties. And there might be attacks and exploits that make some persons liable to the other participants. And we also have liability towards third parties, that's sort of non-members, who can be liable towards contractual parties, which we'll be talking more about today, or they can be sort of liable, or the issue of liability also arises in case of violating certain public policies like the Oki DAO. So to my question, is a specialized civil liability regime required? If you are, that's a kind of a big question, and if you ask some, they will say no. It's no need for a law of the horse, which is taken from Frank Easterbrook in the context of cyberspace. But others might have the approach that we could use civil liability more targeted and use it instrumentally to kind of for DAOs to meet the DAO activities to meet the high-level goals of a civil liability, especially those that are instrumental for public policy. If you ask me, I would like to have both, and I think it's a way to achieve that to some extent. I think if you avoid formalistic analogies in the interpretation of law, because often the question is what is DAOs similar to, and you use an analogy from law, and if you sort of look at similarities instead of the high-level goals of using that analogy, you might achieve what you want. And the kind of contrary to that is to kind of use legal realism and realism analogies in the interpretation of law. And then you can sort of discuss more realistically if some certain form of liability meets the high-level goals of civil liability. And I think that we should consider some specialized regulation only if it's necessary. We should look carefully into existing law and what we can get out of that first. So one topic I would talk about is to maintain responsibility for DAO organized activities in an efficient manner, since I have an economic perspective. I think responsibility is crucial for maintaining civil liability and achieve the high-level goals of civil liabilities. It is necessary to provide compensation to victims, to those that have suffered from civil wrongs. And it's also important for deterrence and compliance reasons. And the question is, how should we maintain causal responsibility? Of course, liability has many elements. I will talk about causal liability because that's kind of particularly interesting when some activity is run by decentralized parties. I think that in many cases that's not so difficult because there are some centralized entities to hold causally responsible. It can be that the DAO is only decentralized in name, so there are people to hold liable, or there might be some kind of actions that are done by centralized parties to hold liable, for instance, if there are some attacks. The kind of true difficulty emerges is if the activity is truly decentralized, because then no one are really causally influential on the outcome. So kind of traditional tests in law, such as the but-for test or the substantial contribution test, which is used for kind of determining liability, come short. I think there are solutions to that. One is, as we know it, to have some sort of group responsibility, to have joint liability, for instance, in terms of a partnership. But I think we could also explore innovative causal concepts in law to kind of hold persons responsible. For instance, transfer of information mechanism. It's a lot to take from philosophy in that respect. When it comes to the maintaining responsibility, it's not like we always can do the first best, and we should also think about an efficient allocation of risk. Sometimes it might not be possible to hold those that kind of are causally closest to the action responsible, for instance, due to pseudonymity. So for efficiency reasons, we might need to hold some some other persons liable. So that, I think, is a huge issue to explore further, kind of how to maintain responsibility. And the next topic I will talk about is to align activities with public policies. I think we need to have a rational approach to risk. Many talk about that we should sort of facilitate innovation. That's one approach, to not miss out on innovation. But I think that it's also important to look at the downside. In AI research, which is sort of more prudent, we are one is often afraid of what is called unstoppable algorithms, and they can be dangerous and so on. So that is also something that has to be taken into account. And I think that if we really use innovative liability standards, we can achieve good trade-offs. We can achieve both. For instance, when it comes to liability for robots, it has been suggested to have some residual liability for developers. That means as long as other participants or other operators are sort of prudent, and or if others are not prudent, then the developers will not be liable. But if they are prudent, then developers have the residual liability. Also here, when it comes to aligning the organized activities with public policies, we need to think about enforcement efficiency. We need to think about the least cost avoider principle, who can avoid the risk at the least cost. We also need to think more about what is the efficient division between private and public enforcement, who should do what. For instance, the government might be more suitable in addressing risks ex ante, while private enforcement works well ex post. And I think that if we use procedural arrangement, we can incentivize private enforcement. I think that is a good thing to use. It's decentralized enforcement, sort of in the spirit of DAOs. So if we make procedural rules, it can be procedural rules such as punitive damages and so on. They can help with this alignment. So one question that has been raised earlier today is code is law. Is that a good policy? I think probably not. And it's only applicable to contractual-like situations anyway. I think it would be a remarkable coincidence if code is law promotes a fair and efficient allocation of risks according to high-level goals of civil liability. And I think it's also important to remember that the code is law does not address harm to third parties or public policies. This is kind of obvious, but it's not like some participant can agree upon that the KYC regulation should not be applicable, for instance. I tried to ask ChatGPT if code is law is a good policy. That you can do yourself too, so I will not spend time on that. But it seemed to agree with me on that matter. So some concluding remarks. I think that when it comes to aligning DAO organized activities with civil liabilities, we can achieve much with existing law. Particularly if We use legal realism in the interpretation of law, and we use realism analogies in the development of liability theories. I think some regulations might be necessary, especially if the legal decision making is too formalist. And if we kind of use civil liability more or less extremely for instrumental purposes, then we will also need to have some new regulations. But I think there are also major obstacles to aligning DAO activities with civil liabilities. That is, as I said, formalist legal reasoning. It is cognitive biases in decisions maker, rent seeking, and institutional failures. It's not necessarily true that the law evolves in an efficient and fair way. So this was what I had. So thank you.